October 12th, 1943. 23,000 feet above the Rhineland, the roar of engines filled a freezing sky. A B-17 Flying Fortress, tail number 423067, shuddered violently as a 20mm cannon shell slammed into its number 3 engine. A burst of black smoke poured from the cowling, thick, oily, and alive with fire. In the cockpit, First Lieutenant Robert Hayes gripped the control yoke as it trembled in his hands. The bomber's nose dipped 15 degrees. The altimeter needle began to spin. Behind him, in the radio compartment, Sergeant Mike Donnelly flinched as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the bulkhead, painting it red like an open wound. The Fortress was mortally wounded, and England was still 140 miles away. Above and off their starboard side, another set of wings caught the sunlight. First Lieutenant James Howell, call sign Jersey 27, banked his P-47 Thunderbolt hard, eyes fixed on the crippled bomber below. Howell, a farm kid from New Jersey with 312 combat hours under his belt, had flown 72 missions over occupied Europe. He'd seen what happened when a bomber fell behind. Once separated, a bomber became prey. The rest of the formation pushed onward, their tight box patterns never breaking. Standard procedure. One damaged ship couldn't endanger the entire group. Hayes knew it. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, had already started running the math in his head. 3 engines alive, max airspeed barely 160 knots indicated. Descent rate climbing 200 feet per minute. German fighters prowled above like sharks smelling blood. Howell's voice crackled over the radio. "Big friend, this is Jersey 27. I've got you in sight. Hang in there." From Hayes came a strained reply, the calm of a man keeping chaos at bay. "Jersey, number 3's burning. We're losing hydraulics. Can't hold altitude." "Copy that, big friend," Howell said, tightening his jaw. "I'm not leaving you." It was a promise, one he had no orders to make. His own fuel gauge hovered just above empty, showing less than an hour's endurance. But he'd seen too many bombers go down alone. He wasn't about to let this one die without a fight. The mission had begun 6 hours earlier at Thorpe Abbotts, home base of the 100th Bomb Group. Hayes and his crew were on their 19th sortie, a daylight strike aimed at the ball bearing factories in Schweinfurt. Intelligence reports had called it light resistance. They were wrong, fatally wrong. 320 B-17s had crossed the channel that morning. Waiting for them were more than 400 Luftwaffe fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, rising like a swarm of hornets across Germany. The sky turned into a killing ground. Bombers exploded mid-air, breaking apart in fire and smoke. Men fell with them. The P-47 escorts fought viciously, but their range was short. When their fuel ran dry near the German border, they had to turn back, leaving the bombers to fend for themselves. Hayes' crew took their first hit during the bomb run. A burst of flak detonated beneath them, tearing through the thin aluminum skin. Sergeant Eddie Martinez, the bald turret gunner, caught shrapnel in his shoulder. In the waist section, Corporal Tommy Briggs was knocked cold when a fragment dented his helmet. He lived, but barely. Moments later came the fighters. 4 FW-190s dropped from the sun at 11 o'clock high, spitting cannon fire. Sergeant Paul Richter, manning the top turret, squeezed his triggers. 50 caliber rounds tore through the sky. His tracers arced toward the lead German plane, hit and hit hard. The Focke-Wulf exploded mid-air, scattering burning fragments across the clouds. But the others pressed on, relentless. Then number 3 engine went silent. Now, 15 minutes out from the target, Hayes fought the yoke with everything he had. The Fortress slid down through 22,000 feet, shaking violently. Morrison worked feverishly to restart the dead engine, but the prop just windmilled uselessly. The hydraulics were nearly gone. Turrets jammed, bomb bay doors half open, the plane bleeding speed and altitude. "Skipper," Morrison said quietly, "maybe we tell them to jump." Hayes didn't answer. Below them stretched occupied France, enemy ground. Bailing out meant capture, maybe worse. And Martinez was wounded. Could he even make it? Not yet, Hayes said at last. Above, Howell's eyes never stopped scanning. The Thunderbolt carried 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, enough for 34 seconds of sustained fire. He'd already burned through 600, 28 seconds of life left in his guns. Movement at 2 o'clock. 3 BF-109s, camouflage blending with the haze, closing fast. They'd spotted the wounded fortress. Stragglers meant easy kills, and the Germans knew it. Howell didn't hesitate. He jammed the throttle forward and banked toward the threat. The Thunderbolt's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine howled, driving all 2,000 horsepower into a climbing intercept. The German lead broke left, but too late. Howell pressed the trigger. 8 machine guns roared in unison, the recoil shaking the cockpit. Empty shell casings streamed from his wings. His tracers found their mark, stitching across the 109's fuselage. A bloom of white coolant erupted from its engine. The fighter rolled, inverted, trailing smoke and vanished into cloud. The others scattered, climbing for altitude. They had expected an easy kill. Instead, they found Jersey 27. And he wasn't backing down. Dawn crept over the Adriatic like a slow-burning fuse. The Jersey Thunder lumbered forward, one of hundreds of bombers stretching from horizon to horizon, a moving armada of thunder and steel. Their mission? Cripple the Poloesti oil fields, the lifeblood of Hitler's war machine. Inside the belly of the plane, the crew of 10 settled into routine. Men who'd flown together so often they could read each other's thoughts without words. James Howell, the pilot, steady, sharp, and cool under pressure. Beside him, Robert Hayes, co-pilot and lifelong friend. The intercom crackled, an eerie familiar static that always preceded chaos. Bandits inbound, 11 o'clock high. Then came the sound every airman dreaded, the whistle of flak. Black puffs blossomed around them like poisonous flowers, shaking the bomber's frame. Metal screamed, the sky turned into a storm of shrapnel and smoke. A burst ripped through the left wing. The aircraft jolted hard, alarms wailing as one of the engines coughed and burst into flame. Feather Engine 3, we're hit, Howell barked, fighting the controls. Hayes reached for the levers, hands trembling but steady enough to follow orders. Feathering now, fire spreading fast. The Jersey Thunder was bleeding altitude. Below, the mountains of Yugoslavia rose like jagged teeth waiting to tear them apart. The formation thinned as bombers either turned back or were torn apart mid-air. Parachutes blossomed in the distance, each one a desperate hope falling through a sky filled with death. Inside the radio compartment, Sergeant Mike Rajachitz yelled over the din. "We've lost 2 planes behind us. The navigator's down." "Stay with it," Howell shouted. "We're not done." The bombardier, Sergeant Thomas Keegan, crawled to the nose, glass shattered all around him. He lined up the target through the cracked Norden sight. On final run, releasing in 3, 2, a violent tremor cut him off. A shell had torn through the fuselage, exploding in the bomb bay. Fire roared upward, flooding the cockpit with smoke. "Bombs away! Get her out!" Keegan screamed, his voice drowned by the inferno. Howell yanked hard on the yoke. The Jersey Thunder climbed for a fleeting second, then the left wing gave out completely. "Brace!" The bomber spiraled, engines howling, metal shrieking like a dying beast. The ground rushed up to meet them. Then, impact. When the smoke cleared, what was once a mighty bomber was now a broken carcass scattered across a Serbian hillside. Howell awoke to the sound of crackling fire and the faint moan of wind through twisted metal. His head throbbed. The cockpit was gone. Hayes lay slumped beside him, unconscious but alive. "Robert, hey, stay with me." Hayes groaned, blood streaking his temple. We make it?" Howell gave a hollow laugh. "Barely." Outside, the wreckage still smoked. Flames licked the earth, and ammunition popped in the distance like dry corn. They pulled the surviving crew from the debris, 5 men out of 10. The rest were gone, consumed by fire or crushed under steel. Rajachits, miraculously unscathed, helped drag Keegan free. "We can't stay here. The Germans will be crawling all over this hill soon." They salvaged what they could, a pistol, a compass, a few rations, and vanished into the forest. The dense Balkan woods swallowed them whole. For 2 days they trudged through ravines and over ridges, drinking from streams, hiding whenever aircraft passed overhead. Every sound felt like a trap, every shadow held a threat. Then on the morning of the 3rd day, they stumbled upon a village, small, half-burned, and eerily silent.
Deep in the Balkan Mountains, far from the front lines, the survivors of the Jersey Thunder now stood at the heart of something far larger than their own tragedy. Operation Halyard, a mission so secret that even the Pentagon barely whispered its name. Captain George Musalin, OSS operative and field commander, gathered the airmen in a barn lit only by flickering oil lamps. His voice was calm, deliberate, the kind that made men listen. "Gentlemen," he said, pointing to a crude map nailed to the wall, "our job isn't just to stay alive. We're getting every stranded airman out of this country. 500, maybe more." The room fell silent. Outside, wind rattled the wooden shutters and the smell of pine smoke clung to the air. "How?" Howell asked, breaking the tension. Musalin gave a faint grin. "By building an airstrip right under the Nazis' noses." They began at dawn, shovels, picks, bare hands. The villagers, men, women, even children, joined the Americans in clearing a long, flat stretch of field near the village of Prignani. They worked in silence, guarded by the forest. Every noise was dangerous, every hour a risk. If the Germans found them, it would mean death for everyone, soldiers and civilians alike. Yet they worked, because the promise of freedom outweighed the fear of dying. Rajachich, now recovering from his wounds, took shifts helping to dig and repair tools. Keegan, whose arm had been burned in the crash, acted as a lookout from a nearby ridge, his eyes scanning the skies for enemy patrols. The field slowly took shape, rough, uneven, but wide enough for a C-47 to land. By mid-August 1944, word came from Bari, Italy. Extraction was approved. Musalin stood with Howell, watching the last few villagers flatten the final stretch. "We'll light the field with lanterns, no radio calls, no flares, just signals and trust." Howell nodded. "And if the Germans show up first, then we fight until the last man." That night, the mountains were alive with whispers. Lanterns flickered across the valley, small, golden beacons guiding the way through darkness. The men waited in silence, rifles in hand, breath misting in the cold night air. Somewhere beyond the peaks, the faint hum of engines grew louder. Musalin raised his head. "They're coming." Moments later, out of the moonlight, 3 C-47 transport planes appeared, black silhouettes gliding low over the mountains. It was a sight so unreal that some of the airmen forgot to breathe. The first plane circled once, dipped its wings in signal, then descended toward the makeshift strip. The landing was rough, tires bouncing against uneven ground, but the pilot held steady. The rear door opened, and American paratroopers jumped out, securing the perimeter in seconds. One of them shouted, "Operation Halyard, let's move." The first group of rescued airmen rushed forward, carrying what little they owned: torn jackets, worn boots, and a lifetime of memories packed into one final moment. Howell stood at the edge of the field, watching the scene unfold. "Go," Musalin said quietly. "You're first." But Howell shook his head. "Not until they're all safe." Musalin didn't argue. He understood. The engines roared as the first plane lifted off, heavy with men and hope. The sound echoed through the valley like a heartbeat of freedom. As the aircraft vanished into the night, a hush fell over the field. They had done it. One flight down, dozens more to go. For weeks, the operation continued. Each night, new planes arrived, guided by lanterns and courage. Each morning, the villagers erased all trace of the runway before daylight revealed it. By the end of August 1944, over 500 Allied airmen had been rescued, without a single man lost under enemy fire. The Germans never discovered the secret, not once. It was a miracle built from sweat, secrecy, and the unbreakable bond between strangers who refused to surrender. When the final C-47 lifted off from the mountains of Pranyani, the valley fell eerily still. The men who had risked everything watched the aircraft disappear into the sunrise, a silver cross vanishing into gold. For Captain George Muselin, the mission's end brought no celebration, just exhaustion, relief, and a gnawing awareness that his work wasn't truly finished. He stayed behind to dismantle what remained of the operation: the hidden airfield, the supply caches, the coded documents, all erased, leaving no sign the Americans had ever been there. The villagers went back to their lives. The life was a fragile word in wartime Yugoslavia. Some would soon face retribution from German patrols. Others would vanish into the partisan ranks, swallowed by another front of the same brutal war. For Muselin, it was time to return to Italy and to secrecy. When he stepped off the transport plane in Bari, the sun was blinding. Officers from the OSS greeted him with crisp salutes, clipboards in hand. There were no medals, no photographs, no questions. Operation Halyard would not be spoken of publicly. Not now, maybe not ever. Officially, it didn't happen. The politics of the Balkans were shifting fast. Tito's communist partisans were gaining power, and the Western Allies, desperate to keep fragile alliances intact, quietly buried any story that might threaten that balance. The Americans rescued by Muselin and his team were sworn to silence. They were alive, yes, but their story was classified, sealed away in dusty archives for decades. Back in the States, Howell and Hayes returned to their families as heroes no one could talk about. The Army gave them commendations, brief words, and a handshake. Then the war moved on, swallowing their story in the noise of victory. For years afterward, Howell had the same dream, standing in that cold Serbian valley, lanterns flickering in the dark, the rumble of engines approaching through mountain mist. He'd wake up before the plane landed, always before it landed. He tried to write about it once, but the words never felt right. How could he explain the way strangers had risked everything for men they'd never met? How could he put into words what gratitude feels like when it's larger than language itself? In 1948, Captain Muselin was summoned to Washington. He expected recognition. Instead, he got suspicion. The post-war political machine saw Yugoslavia differently now. Tito was no longer an ally, and the OSS was gone, replaced by the CIA. Muselin was questioned, scrutinized, and eventually dismissed from service. The man who'd led one of the greatest rescues of the war was quietly erased from its official story. For the next 30 years, he lived in silence, carrying the weight of a mission the world had forgotten. But history has a way of resurfacing truth. In 1980, long after the Cold War reshaped the world, documents began to declassify, names reappeared, testimonies resurfaced, and for the first time, the story of Operation Halyard reached the public eye. Journalists called it the forgotten miracle. Veterans wept as they read the reports, seeing the names of the villagers who had saved them, men and women who had long since passed, their courage written only in memory. In 1985, a small memorial was erected in Pranyani, a simple stone engraved with the words, to those who risked everything for freedom. When Howell stood before that stone, he placed his hand on the cold marble and whispered, "We never forgot you." Beside him, Robert Hayes smiled faintly. "Think Musalin ever thought we'd come back here?" Howell shook his head. He didn't do it for that. None of them did. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the faint echo of propellers, or maybe just the sound of memory. Some stories fade with time. Others become legends told only in whispers. Operation Halyard was both a miracle buried in mountains and a testament to what courage looks like when the world isn't watching.
When the guns finally fell silent across Europe, the world moved on. But in the hills of western Serbia, the earth still held the memory of lantern light, the glow that once guided men to freedom. The war ended, borders shifted, flags changed, and like so many small miracles born in chaos, Operation Halyard slipped quietly into the background of history, unspoken, uncredited, almost forgotten. The men who came home. For the airmen who returned to America, homecoming felt different. They were alive, but not the same. Each man carried two memories: the terror of falling from the sky and the kindness of strangers who refused to let them die on foreign soil. James Howell settled in the Midwest, started a family, and tried to live a quiet life. To most, he was just another veteran, one of millions. But at night, when the wind was right, he could still hear the hum of the C-47 engines, still see the lanterns dotting the field like fallen stars. Robert Hayes moved west, worked in aviation for decades, always telling the same story in fragments. "If you ever think the world's lost its heart," he'd say, "remember a place called Prongeny." Sergeant Michael Rajacic became a mechanic after the war, his hands still carrying the scars of the crash. He wrote letters to the families of the villagers who'd helped them, letters that took years to reach their destinations, traveling through censored borders and secret channels. Some were never delivered. Thomas Keegan, the bombardier, never flew again. He spent his life speaking in schools, quietly teaching kids that heroism wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a farmer with a shovel or a mother offering bread to a starving stranger. None of them became famous. None of them asked to be. The man history erased. Captain George Musalin, the man who led one of the most daring rescue missions of the war, returned home to a country that had already forgotten his name. Politics had changed, allies had become adversaries, and the new Cold War demanded new loyalties. The U.S. government, trying to maintain fragile relations with Yugoslavia's new communist leadership, buried Halyard deep in classified archives. His mission reports were sealed, his commendations were redacted. The story that should have made headlines was buried under diplomatic silence. He went on with his life, quietly. Married, worked, served again in covert operations, this time for a government that no longer spoke his name aloud. But those who had served under him never forgot. To them, he was more than a commander. He was the man who refused to leave anyone behind. When asked about the mission years later, Musalin only said one thing: "We didn't go there for medals. We went because those men were counting on us." He died in 1987, long before his story was truly told. The villagers who risked everything. In Yugoslavia, the people of Prongeny returned to their farms. They rebuilt their homes from rubble and raised children in the same valleys where the airmen had once hidden. They never saw themselves as heroes. To them, helping the Americans was simply the right thing to do. But the price they paid was heavy. Some were arrested after the war by the new communist authorities for collaborating with Western forces. Others were questioned, threatened, even imprisoned.
Their act of humanity became a quiet act of defiance. Still, they kept the memory alive. Old men told their grandchildren stories of the flying Americans who fell from the sky. Mothers pointed toward the ridges and whispered, "That's where they built the runway." The children grew up with legends, and for a long time, that's all Operation Halyard was, a legend whispered through generations. The silence breaks. In the late 1970s, something changed. A few historians, persistent, skeptical, and fascinated, stumbled upon fragments of reports in declassified OSS files. The details were stunning. An entire air rescue operation behind enemy lines, executed flawlessly. How had no one heard of it? They began to dig deeper, interviewing surviving airmen, piecing together testimonies, locating families in Serbia who still remembered Captain Georgi, as the villagers called Musulin. The forgotten story started to breathe again. By the 1980s, American veterans returned to Prongeni for the first time in 40 years. They found the same mountains, the same stone houses, aged but unchanged. The villagers greeted them not as guests, but as sons returning home. One of the old farmers pointed to a patch of meadow and said, "Right there, that's where your plane landed." There were tears, laughter, unbelief. Men in their 60s and 70s stood together on soil they'd once fought to escape, now sacred ground connecting two worlds. It wasn't just a reunion, it was history finding its voice again. Recognition, at last. In 1985, the US and Yugoslav governments jointly honored the villagers of Prongeni for their courage. A small memorial was built near the site of the original airfield. Nothing grand, just a simple stone with carved words, "To those who risked everything for freedom." To the people who had lived through it, the monument wasn't just a tribute, it was proof. Proof that what they'd done mattered even if the world had taken 40 years to notice. Decades later, in 2004, the US ambassador to Serbia attended a ceremony in the same village. He spoke before the descendants of those same peasants and the grandchildren of rescued pilots. His voice trembled slightly as he said, "The world forgot your story, but America did not. Not anymore." Echoes across generations. Today, the field at Prongeni is quiet again. A stretch of open land where sheep graze and wind moves softly through the grass. But every year, descendants of both the rescuers and the rescued gather there. They bring photographs, flags, and stories. They light candles at sunset, just as their grandparents once lit lanterns for the C-47s in 1944. The ceremony is simple. No politicians, no headlines, just remembrance. And when the sun dips behind the mountains, someone always reads aloud the list of names, both the airmen who were saved and the villagers who risked everything to save them. Each name echoes off the hills. Each name, a heartbeat from the past.